So, welcome. Can you all hear me? Welcome to Meet Sakai's Morpheus. We'll begin. I hope it seems a bit warmer in here. It's freezing in this room. Okay, so I titled this Meet Sakai's Morpheus, but really it's more Sakai Meet Morpheus. And what is Morpheus? It's the mobile, optimized, responsive portal for higher education using Sass. And for those who like HBO's Silicon Valley, it's social, it's mobile, and it's and for those who haven't seen that show, ignore it. Okay. So one thing about this presentation is I'm using Reveal.js. It's a HTML, JavaScript, Sass kind of slideware. For someone who writes HTML and CSS, it's much easier to think and write in this format. It's up in GitHub. There will be a nice PDF up on Lanyard afterwards. Yeah, but if you want to, there's a PDF up in the GitHub repo already. So I'm going to start with that kind of the 5 W's: the who, when, where, what, and most importantly, why. Why is important? So let's start with the who. I am Mark Riley. I am a user experience designer, and I'm at New York University. Okay. So let's go to the
At last, as you no doubt have guessed, I am Morpheus.
So that's the what. So let's go to the where. So Morpheus is in Sakai 10. It's in, and it's really in the 2 parts, 2 branches. In portal, and reference. Okay, so portal is where the templates are, and reference is where the CSS is. So these are the links. And then let's get to the when. So it's now-ish. So we have the templates in. They were committed in February. And the Sass is under active development. I'm a little behind. I had hoped to get back. I put in the stuff in February, and then I had to go back and do stuff for NYU classes. And that went a little longer, by about 5 weeks. So I'm about 5 weeks behind where I thought when I submitted this presentation. So I don't have so much of a working demo, but I have plenty to show you and explain how that system works. Okay. So this is coming to the why, and I think this is an important part. Why another new skin? We just had a new skin in 2.9, and now we're having another one in 10. And the main reason is when we first started at NYU, we did something unprecedented for NYU, or at least ITS, is we did some usability testing in our pilot. And I worked with Francesca, who's our service lead, and we tested, we did it first thing in the pilot. So one thing, as I was tasked to design a skin, put the NYU logo up there. And I really didn't want to do too much to it other than that. I wanted to do some usability testing and see what the issues were. So in the pilot, we did some usability testing. We got faculty. They were our target audience. We wanted, because it was a pilot, it was great. We had a lot of faculty who had never seen Sakai. So we got them involved. And we did remote testing because we kind of wanted, we didn't want the artificialness of the usability lab. We wanted to get them in their office, or one was actually at a Starbucks, and just see what kind of browsers there were with computers, just see them in their natural environment. So the usability issues we uncovered we certainly within some of the tools there was, but we found there was a lot of general usability issues, especially about place finding, knowing where you were in the system. And remember, these are people who had never seen the system. They hadn't had a chance to learn the system. But they did get lost quite easily. And navigation was also another issue. Messaging was unclear. And just hiding and showing items was confusing too. So some of the solutions, we came up with some quick fixes. So for the transitioning from the pilot to the general release, we put in a bunch of quick fixes to help alleviate it. But we realized that there was a lot of longer-term fixes that we wanted to clear up some of the ambiguity about some of the icons. The biggest one in 2.8 was kind of the reset icon was beside the minimize nav icon. And it just, people didn't really understand what the icons were. One looked like a rewind. Another one, they thought reset might delete some things, some language as well as visual cues. And then a lot of issues were around iframe. So most of the tools are in an iframe. And it wasn't clear, because everything was white on white, that this was actually a widget, especially when you get to my workspace. And there's different calendar widgets. It's not obvious. The mental model wasn't there, that these are separate chunks of technology. And I think in other portals, we were looking at iGoogle when it existed. They had this kind of widget box around them. So you had a better mental model that this was a widget and not just part of the page. So we wanted to fix that. We also wanted to group some of the navigation items by function. And that exists in Sakai. There's a tool order XML that you can specify the tools and which ones are selected, which ones are required. But you can also add in categories. And then we wanted better messaging, so clearer that this is a warning, not an error, because we came across that quite a bit. So often the messages are a red exclamation mark with red text. And it may be like, oh, you only want to use this, I think it's in the grade book in 2.8. There's a warning saying, you want to be in one browser window to grade, because you can get into conflicts if you have multiple browser windows open. But people were really freaked out about this and started closing things because it didn't go away. Because it was a warning, not an error. So people would close all their windows, they'd change browsers, they would do a lot of things, and then they would kind of realize, I've done everything, it must be, it's not me, it's the system. But their initial reaction is, it's me, I've done something wrong. So, for the user interface, what I wanted to do, if I was going to restart the user interface, or at least I felt that we needed a new foundation to build upon. And this is part of what Morpheus is a new foundation to build up onto user interface. One thing that was problematic was it wasn't organized that easily. Now the CSS in the Neoskin and stuff are in categories, and there is some good documentation in the CSS. But it's one big file, or a few big files with thousands of lines. And what tends to happen in CSS, because it's cascading, is people just put things on the bottom. So rather than go change things, find out where the issue is, they'll just add something to the bottom which will override what they said on the top. Or they'll write important, which will override everything. So we want to make it a little more organized so that it's easier to add things to it, and also to make it modular, so that this little, that this little bit is for gradebook, or this chunk is for the messages, and we also want to make it reusable. And to do all of this in CSS, you really need to use a CSS preprocessor. There's a few of these out there. Wes and Sass are probably the biggest ones. For me, Sass was my choice for various reasons. So let's just break from this for a second. And I'm just going to show you some of the stuff we did at NYU, just to give you an overview of that. Okay, so this is our current skin, and these are some slides internal, so that they're not 100% up to date. We did change some of the wording here and there. So one thing we wanted to do when we were changing the user interface was we didn't want to scare our users and change things overnight. So we came up with this idea that most of the Facebook and Google, and that is that you can optionally tune into it. It would be a bit different now if we were upgrading from 2.9 to 10 because it's part of an upgrade. But here we weren't upgrading, we were just changing the interface. So we put in a thing called preview mode. You click on this, and then you enter into the site here. And we moved my workspace here up from the tabs. And we have a different color for my workspace because we found a lot of times in 2.8 anyway that people really were getting confused between my workspace and the core site tabs. It looked the same. They didn't really get this. And I think there's still confusion. I really think part of it is my workspace is a terrible name. My account, for your average user. If you're an administrator, yeah, maybe administrator workspace makes sense. But my workspace, people always say, I don't work as and they just ignore it. It's like they can't get away from my workspace fast enough. And we've seen that in many tests, both in the old and the new. And so here we've put these little widget boxes around the different iframes. We've also made the titles clickable. And this actually came from our faculty advisory group. Instead of having just to click on the reset icon, you can just click on the title because that's much more natural. And when we retested this in pre-flight testing, people just clicked on it. So it was great. We did add the icon to the side because we did a couple of A/B testing that we removed the icon and people were confused. But when we put the icon and the clickable title, it was very natural. And we had a few people from NYU Poly who weren't on Sakai. We had them test who hadn't seen it. And it worked very well with them. They naturally clicked on the titles. Clicking on that little reset icon is really unintuitive. And then we made help more intuitive, this in-place help. And we actually saw people click on it for the first time because on our previous design it's a white, it's off in the corner, floating out there, and people just miss it. It's more prevalent on the, and then options, we put a little cog there because that's really what it is. It wasn't quite obvious what options were, but it's really kind of settings for the different tools. So here's place finding. We just made these a little more obvious. Oh, sorry, we're just jumping to a course site here. And this is our course site. And this is our nav bar. We've put in categories here. And we've made where you are is much more prevalent, prominent. And these are our categories. We've made this a little more obvious instead of the rewind button, this icon here. And then we have these icons here with also the placeholder where you are. And the categories are similar too. And there's going to be a bit of a learning curve to know which are these categories, but you can always expand. And then we've added, it's a little hard to see on this slide, there's a little eye icon with a slash through it to show that this is hidden. I think it's italic in the default one, which is more confusing. So this means that settings is hidden to your students. And then if you go into add edit tool, we did some customization to this just to put in our categories here and the icons. And if you go into tool order, we restricted it so you can change things within the categories. But also what we've done is we've added the categories, and then the icons here, the visibility ones are the same, so that makes it a little more intuitive. And then here's some of our messaging. Okay. So let's get back to the one thing was that, so this was our first part, and then the second part was for NYU classes, was really to start it, to make it a responsive design. So once I had this foundational Sass stuff that we'll go into a little more, I wanted to make it responsive. So it's now responsive design, 3 basic elements: fluid images, fluid grids, immediate queries. At least in Sakai is fairly fluid, but we ran into a number of issues. And probably the biggest thing to do with responsive design is how to figure out where the menus on the small device. And we have a lot of menus in Sakai. So. Then also to make things responsive, you often have to change around or a little tweak the HTML source order a little bit. And especially the Sakai markup has been built up over the years, and it has a lot of divs. So it's kind of got divided, it's convoluted. That makes it more complicated to change the markup. And it's really missing a lot of classes on different things. So everything has an ID, and that makes things specificity much more complicated. And you're just, as far as CSS architecture, it's a little more confusing. So we really wanted to go into, we felt if we were going to do a responsive design, we really need to change the markup. And then we came to the big issue, which was upgrade. If we go in and change our markup significantly, it's much easier just to port the CSS over there. But if we go in and change the markup significantly in our NYU 2.8 instance, how do we move to 2.9 or 10 or whatever? So that's kind of when we paused for, and at the same time we also had a community review of our new UI, and Gonzalo Michigan was like, we would love to have this in Sakai. So then we were like, well, let's put in our Sass-based UI that will be good for everyone. And also, let's make some new templates where we can solve some of these issues. So let's dig into Morpheus. And wait, before I do that, I'm just going to show you a quick mock-up. So this is just a one-page snapshot, and this is a prototype. And then basically, if you make it smaller, it has. And this isn't the final thing that I use, but it was just I wanted to go in before changing things over. Just grab some HTML dump, and then just add CSS on top and see how much work it involved to get it responsive, to add in these menus and kind of jump down. And that was when I thought, oh, this is a lot of, we really need to change the source order quite a bit. And that's really where it was paused. Think about how we would do this in a sustainable and maintainable way. So let's dig into Morpheus.
Do you want to know what it is?
Okay, so what it is. So it's really 2 parts. The new velocity markup templates, and then the CSS compiled from Sass. So we're going to just go over these 2 things here. So the new VM templates are Apache Velocity templates, and they've been in since February. So one of the reasons is, why is this not quite built thing in Sakai 10. And that was because we were originally thinking it would go at 10.1 or 10.2, but they didn't want to add in any new features at this, because it's a different philosophy of how they manage the release cycle. So we had the templates already, we put them in. We put in the CSS, but it really doesn't do anything at the moment at that time too. So it will be out there. It's an experimental feature, so you have to turn it on. So while it's not quite working, it's in there, and in trunk will be the stuff that gets working. So if you are interested, you will be able to start playing around with this in probably a month or two, where it'll be worth doing. Okay, so the first thing we did was we converted the templates to HTML5. This just cleans up the markup a bit. It simplifies things, and it just adds some new semantic tags like navigation, section, things that are good. So here we have a nice clean head. Can you see that too well? Let's see. Contrast isn't great. This is just saying there's a IE conditional tag for. The one thing we did want to do was make sure that IE8 is supported, because there's still a significant amount of users out there on IE8. And here we've and you'll see these more on the PDF. These are just conditional tags. One for the HTML5 shim, which just tells IE8 not to ignore the HTML5 things, technical thing. And then we have a style sheet that only IE8 understands, and then a style sheet for everyone else. The big thing with responsive design in IE8 is it doesn't understand media queries. Luckily, with the way Sass is set up, I can say, for IE8, just take the desktop media query, don't put it in a media query, and just spit it out as CSS, and it's happening. So, and this actually worked pretty well with our portal, because I'm not sure if people are on 2.8, but it only understands IE8 CSS and JavaScript for every IE portal, because it's forced. Sakai, because IE9 was just out when 2.8 was coming, back a few years ago, and things were so different, it was breaking, that they forced all IEs to act like IE8. So we have a pretty good IE8 style sheet. And because our IE9, 10, and 11 users are getting it. I think nearly all of that was fixed in 2.9, and 10 is working, I think, pretty well with IE11. I'm really looking forward to not seeing IE8 stuff for all of IE, because the new IEs are bad. Okay, and then one thing I did do was I put in the Morpheus script into the skin. So this is just a JavaScript that you can use. Currently it controls the minimize and things like that. But just you can add JavaScript in the skin for your instance. But you might want to do that. There may be something you want to do. So this will come, you'll get the default stuff, and then you can just add, if you need to do any little tweaks there, you've got one in there. So this is you can add your own skin, and then, so this is just in the template, it just will know what skin you're in. And then just in the VM folder, so most of these templates, unless you're doing some serious customization, you're not really going to be working with, but I did notice there was a lot of reused markup, and it was kind of conditional. So if this type of login is this, do that. So I just created a snippets folder and made it simpler from that. I've seen that. I've done a lot of theming and different stuff in Drupal and various things, and this is a pattern that other places use. So I just wanted to use best practices. And then going into the thing, I wanted just to add in a lot of classes to the markup and leave in those IDs, because there's plenty of JavaScript bits and bobs all over the place that may be reliant. So I didn't want to break anything. So we're adding multiple classes. So it makes it more reusable and modular. And the idea is kind of a single responsibility theory, so that one class does one thing. And that way you can reuse things. So maybe you'll have something called a wrapper class, and it just has 2 rules, but it's all over the place, so it's reused. And then you can have classes that relate to layout, to states, and to Java. So is hidden is one, or is visible, or JS. You can put JS in front of them to say, this is a class just for JavaScript. So don't style it, but JavaScript is looking for that. And that's just someone who comes in later to look at that is, oh, that's a JavaScript. That's important. Rather than this is, one class that does all of these things, and you change it, and then suddenly things aren't working. You don't know why. It's because it's not only is it for layout, it's for style, it's and it's for JavaScript. So just the idea is kind of breaking things up a bit. Yeah. So and then leaving the IDs for legacy JavaScript. Okay. So let's move on to the Sass. So what is Sass? So just a quick show of hands. Does anyone know what Sass is or has experience with it? Okay. So the minority. So that's what I thought. Okay. So it stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. Great name. And basically what it does, CSS is just a flat file. It doesn't have things that you expected. It's on a programming language. It's just kind of rules. And what it's missing, and what Sass and other CSS preprocessors do, brings in things that you kind of expect, variables, functions. Mixin is kind of a function, and extend, and nesting. And I'll just go through some of these, and at imports and partials. So what at import and partials is important is you can break things, instead of having one giant file, you can break things into discrete level files. And if you put an underscore, it doesn't. So in Sass, if you have something, say stylesheet.scss, that will generate stylesheet.css. If there's an underscore in front of it, it doesn't generate a corresponding stylesheet, a CSS. So you can break things in, and these are called partials. So you can break things really discreetly. So you can learn more at sasslang.com, the guide, and there's really a lot of, it's a great community, there's a lot of documentation, there's a lot of meetups, conferences, and it's really growing and growing. So. And one other thing is there's a lot of open source extensions and frameworks. So Compass is one of them. But a lot of the stuff we're using here is people have figured out how to do this. So dealing with breakpoints and other stuff is out there, and you can leverage them. And they're Compass gems, so you can be part of your build process. And you're really getting a lot using Sass. It's not just a language. So let's look at variables. Not sure how well you can see. I'll try to make it a bit bigger. But basically, here's one is your institutional color. So in NYU, it's violet. And here you can just, instead of putting the color value everywhere in your CSS, and then if you want to change it, so if for your university, you have to do like a find and replace and things like that. Here you can just have one global color, and you just replace it there, and it will be when it's compiled, it will be updated. So that's a very simple thing, but it's really useful. Having variables is really useful. So here is a mixin. So if you have, say, a default type size, font size 16, line height 1.5, you can just reference this and at include, say, default type size in my paragraph and my footer. And then this is the compile CSS underneath, and that's what it does. And then let's go, that's a mixin. Now mixins are really better with arguments, so that you have, this one is here, is I'm saying whatever, I'm passing color to it. So I'm including the type size, but I want to include the color here. So my paragraph is, like a near black color, but my footer is on a color, and it needs to be reversed out. So then I'm passing a near white color. That's what happens there. And they can have multiple arguments. So I can also pass the size, font size, and the color. So here I want my footer to be a little smaller. So I'm just reusing stuff here. And this builds up over time. With extends, it's kind of similar to mixing. But it's really just kind of default size. The one thing that it does do differently. So if you're going to use a mixin, you really want to have an argument. Otherwise, use an extend. Because the one thing that the extend does is it groups these things together. So before you could see there was a P and a footer. Now there's P, comma, footer. So you've reduced a lot of code here. Things are all grouped together nicely. So that's kind of why you'd use an extend. You can also do this. So this is great for kind of alerts and messages. So you have your default styles. So here we have our default types. But in the footer, we want to pass a different. So we have the same font size and line height, but in the footer, we also have a different color because it's reversed now. And this we use this a lot for the messaging. So you have your different alerts that all have around the border or whatever, and a background and a border color. But then you want to have different colors for your success message, and maybe a different one for your warning. Yeah, and buttons. This is great for buttons. You'll have your active button, your disable button, your cancel button. That's good. And then the other thing is you can nest things that are together. So this makes it a little more readable, and you can see how the inheritance goes. And then this is probably the biggest thing is you can import different things. So here I just have a little reset, and I'm importing it into my other file, my base. Okay, so Sass is very powerful, can be misused, and it's brittle. So what we really need is an architecture behind this. Okay, and that brings us to Smacks. And that is Scalable and Modular Architect for CSS. It's written by Jonathan Snook, and he works for Yahoo. There's a lot of kind of object-oriented CSS stuff coming from Yahoo because they have so many products, so many diverse teams. They really started to have to think about these problems. So they'd have a widget from Mail and a different widget here, and things would collide. So they started to come up with better organization structures. Okay. So learn more at smacks.com. So basically the core of Smacks is categorization. And there are 5 types of categories. There's base styles, layout, module, state, and theme. Just go through some base are your defaults, your input types, your tag, your link colors, your page ones, things that are going to be the same everywhere. And then layout rules divide the page into sections. So here's just an example where we have a fluid layout, and then with this class, which will probably be on the body, l.fixed, it says this is actually a fixed width. So you could have different pages. And then kind of the core of Smacks is the modules. So they're reusable, they're modular parts of the design. They're the callouts, the sidebar sections, product lists, and so on. That can be your header, your footer, your menu, all of these things. And then you can have different So we have pod and pod-collab for different variations of the theme. So depending where they are, if it's in the center of the page or if it's on the side. And then state describes how if it's hidden, if it's if it's expanded, different things. So this is usually a prefix with is. So is active, so instead of selected, is active. And it's also a visual cue, so when you're reading or looking at the thing, you're like, is something, that gives you an idea that it's a state. So, and then theme, and theme rules are similar to state rules, but it just describes how things work. So, and this is a little different in SCSS, where here we're having one file override another. So the basic one, and then the theme one. So if you had to say dark theme or a light theme. With Sass, we can just change the variable in our theme, so we don't have to have two. So we'll get into that. So if you combine Smacks and Sass, you get scalar and modular architecture for Sass, or Smassas. Or Smackass? Let's not go there. Let's just stick to Morpheus. Okay. So let's get into Morpheus. So in the directory structure, we have Morpheus master and 3 example sites. So for Sakai 10, I just wanted to narrow down the multitude of example sites to 3 really good examples. So we're going to have Morpheus default. That's going to be your Sakai 10 blue thing. We're going to have Morpheus example view where it's a customized version, very universal. And then I thought the most important one that was left was right to left. And if anyone has an institution that really uses right to left a lot, I'd love to get some feedback there. But with Sass, you can really say, if I can set a global right to left, and then anything that's float right can be float left, and I can change all the padding and things like that. So it can be one. It can also be if the template, I'm not sure if the template has logic, but if you put it actually on the HTML, Sass can pick that up too. So and the one thing is Morpheus master will have all the Sass files and the compile script. And then the other ones will have generated CSS. And on the top of the CSS, there's a warning saying, this is generated CSS. If you change it, it may be overwritten once you do your SVA update, so don't run anything. And I'll get into how one compiles CSS. It's pretty easy. So this is how you import a module name. So we've brought in the Smacks system here. So we have modules, and then the module name, say, more realistic example is alerts, and then underscore alerts, pull in everything to do with alerts. And this is where the file would be, Morpheus master modules underscore alerts. And there may, depending on how complicated it is, there may be additional files to pull in. So from alerts, it may pull in alerts variables, alerts mixers, alerts extendables. And just to really put, this is the stuff that goes on in this thing. So, as I said, your button classes, you might have it stands for buttons. They're in this folder. They're all together. It's easy to see what's going on. And then to just get Morpheus up and running, we just changed some Sakai properties. The portal.neofix doesn't quite work. It only accepts neo or nothing. But that will get you started. So, as I said before, Morpheus will shift with 3 themes: Morpheus default, example view, and Morpheus right to left. And they are in Morpheus master Sass themes. So they're just one file. And this is where you put in all the overrides for that. And there's also, if I wanted to create then an NYU one, I just create a file called Morpheus underscore NYU. And when I hit the compile script, that will create a folder called Morpheus NYU and put in the CSS. I'll also want to copy over some JavaScript stuff and things like that. That will all be documented once it's kind of finalized. It's working now, but it's just I haven't thoroughly worked out the workflow yet. I'd love to put grunt in there and get it to do it and minify it and all this whiz bang stuff. But I don't want to add another dependency. I'm already putting Ruby in here to put in Node.js. Just a little too much. So one thing why we're doing this compile script is we wanted to bring people who want to create a very simple. They just need to put their logo and the colors, and just be able to do that really easily without learning Sass, and that it would work. And also that when you download Sakai 10, that there are CSS files. Now, maybe if this goes into Sakai 11 as a core thing, which is kind of the idea, there will be part of the build script that it will be generated. So with the idea is you don't really put CSS if you're using Sass into your repository because it gets overwritten. It gets generated when you build your Sakai instance. For now, we're kind of going in a slightly different method just to ease the transition. So here's some basic institutions. So you can just change your primary color. You can add your logo. And then you can change your button color. These are probably, I was looking through the Sakai skin document, and these are kind of what I outlined. Now, what Morpheus brings that, so this is a lot easier, but what Morpheus really brings is advanced customization. So if you want web fonts, icon fonts, if you want to add different icons, so we're creating an icon font. It'll all be on GitHub as a default, but you may want to add your own. We have a couple of tools that are just NYU for the libraries, and they want to have their own custom icon. So you can add to that. And these are based off of Font Awesome and using icon. This will all be documented. It'll be pretty easy just to add an icon to that. Yeah, and there's anything that's an asset that's not anything is going to be in this repo, and there'll be extensive documentation. So you could also then have custom tools. You could just add in your custom module name. So that's one great thing. It's modular. You can just plug this in and call the file. And then the other thing is the style guides. So where it's one flat HTML page where you can put example code and see the source and see the style. So you can see your style guides here. And I'll be adding more Sakai components to these. How are we doing on time? Getting close.
2 more minutes, Mark.
And there's also a color schemer. So you can generate a color scheme here, and I'll just jump to the conclusion, and then I'll show you the style guide and the color scheme. Okay, so what's next? So we have to finish adding the modules from that and customize the modules from our 2.8 one, working with 2.10. Start working on responsive menus. It's going to be the first part. It's probably the hardest part of the responsive design. I'd like to work on responsive typography. I've done some demos on this. So just that the typography will change depending on how wide your window is. So, which will be good for things like TVs with big displays. And I really want to have good example skins. And then definitely we will be doing iterative user testing throughout. And then documentation is a big part of this. Right? The Sakai documentation is pretty good, and I want to keep up with that. And then moving to Sakai 11, the next thing will be start to really work on tools and getting a pattern library together so that things are a lot more consistent. I'm just adding classes to that. And this is kind of a mini bootstrap for Sakai. And there's been talk about putting Bootstrap, which is Twitter Bootstrap, into Sakai, but I'm not really a huge fan of Bootstrap for many reasons. But I just feel it's very like Helvetica. Works in a lot of really good places, can be used a lot of times. It's a great base, but it doesn't have much character. And I think Sakai, we can put in by building our own, we can make it very Sakai specific. Okay. So I just want to thank Gonzalo and everyone. There's so many of us at NYU here to thank them. And then I just want to show you quickly the style sheet, and then we'll do questions. So this is an example of the NYU style sheet. So you have your typographical elements and your buttons. And this will work in, in the Sass, there's a file that just compiles all of this, so that you can use this, so you can change this without having to load up Sakai. And you can just add different form elements, and then here's some messagings, different icons, pagers, and then this is the color guide. So this is kind of cool. It's just this color generates all of these other colors, and these are variables that you can then change. So you can play around with these colors, and it uses color theory. And there's a site actually that you can play around with these colors and try different. It uses all these color theory ways to pick colors. So I mean, play with hue. So if you need to generate a nice looking site, this is a good model for this. And you don't have to use it. And then, so basically a couple of variables, you can change this around. So here's one that's kind of a Miami style. It's a little brighter on my screen versus kind of this one. So it's just basically one variable, and the color model is changed to generate a very different. Okay, so let's go back to, are there any questions? I'm also, anyone who wants to contribute, it's great to have people's input on this.